Hi everyone, I'm Alexander M. Kabangbang from Bachelor of Secondary Education, major in Social Studies, and this is my report in Module 2, the communication process, some notes and perspectives with applications of local and global communication as applied in the multicultural classroom settings. 2.3 Stages of Communication. Good communication skills are essential to effective business communications. At its core, the aim of communication is to transmit information from one person to another. So, the sender and receiver understand the message in the same way. The responsibility for clear communication usually falls on the sender, but the receiver is also responsible to confirm a clear understanding of the message. Communication is a dynamic and cyclical process. Breaking down the communication cycle into its parts, it's helpful to understand the responsibilities of both the sender and the receiver of communication, as well as to identify communication barriers. So this is a graph, the five-step communication process. So as you can see, there's a message, there's a feedback message, there's an interpretation, both sides, and encoding, decoding. It's just a vice versa. So there are five steps of communication process. So the first step is the idea formation. So what is idea formation? The idea formation is the communication process begins when the sender has an idea to be communicated. The idea will be influenced by complex factors surrounding the sender. The sender must begin by clarifying the idea and purpose. What exactly does the sender want to achieve? How is the message likely to be perceived? Or knowing this information provides a higher chance of successful communication. The step 2 is the message encoding. The idea must be encoded into words, symbols, and gestures that will convey meaning, because no two people interpret information in the exact same way. The sender must be careful to choose words, symbols, and gestures that are commonly understood to reduce the chance of misunderstanding. Therefore, a sender must be aware of the receiver's communication skills, attitudes, skills, experiences, and culture to ensure clear communication. Step 3. The message transmission. Choosing the medium transmit uh, to the message is the next step in the communication process. Messages can be transmitted in a verbal, written, or visual manner. I will let you see a table on the next page. For clear communication to occur, the medium and message must match. The medium and the message must match. As you can see on the table, there are three, it is divided into three, the verbal, the written, and the visual. So, for a clear communication, as what I've said earlier after before this table or before this page, as what I've said, that the medium and the message must match. So it must be match. So the step 4 is the decoding. When the message reaches the receiver, the message must be deactivated into its intended meaning. Therefore, the receiver must translate the words, symbols, and gestures as the sender intended, because no two people interpret information in the exact same way. Incorrectly decoding a message can lead to misunderstanding. Successful decoding is more likely when the receiver creates a receptive environment and ignores distractions. Alert receivers strive to understand both verbal and nonverbal cues, avoid prejudging the message, and expect to learn from the communication. And the last step is the feedback. A vital part of the communication process is feedback. Feedback occurs the sender and receivers check to ensure the message was understood as intended. Feedback is a shared responsibility between the sender and the receiver and can be verbal or nonverbal. For example, the sender can elicit feedback by asking, "Do you have any questions?" Or the sender can also improve the feedback process by only providing as much information as the receiver can handle. Receivers can encourage clear communication by providing clear, timely, descriptive, and non-judgmental feedback. For example, the receiver can shake his or her hand head up and down to confirm, yes, I have a question. So I post or I paste some link in this part. So if you will watch the video, or as you watch the video, the whole process is easier than the said, because you can encode incredible masses of data to transmit to the others all day long in multiple channels, often at once, and are likewise bombarded with a constant multi-channel stream of information in each of the five senses that you have decoded without being even consciously aware of this complex process. You just do it. Even when you merely talk to someone in person, you communicating not just the words you're voicing, but also through the tone of your voice, volume, speed, facial expressions, eye contact, posture, hand movements, styles of dress, and etc. All such channels convey information besides the words themselves, which, if they were extracted into a transcript of words on a page on your screen, communicate relatively little. So in professional situations, in important ones such as job interviews or meetings with the clients where your success depends entirely on how will you communicate across the verb. So, the key takeaway. So, as a cyclical exchange of message, the goal of communication is to ensure that you move an idea in your head into someone else's head so that they understand your idea as you understood it. So, the other one is the communication process has 5 steps. What are those steps? It's the idea formation, the encoding, the channel selection, decoding, and feedback. And anything that interferes with clear communication is called noise. What is noise? A barrier that makes interfere a communication. So noise can interfere with each step of the communication process. So that could be all for my report in 2.3. So let's move on into 2.4. The 2.4 is the level of communication. So before we dive into the history of communication, it is important that we have a shared understanding of what we mean by the word communication. For our purposes in this book, or in this lesson, or in this report, we will define communication as the process of generating meaning by sending and receiving verbal and nonverbal symbols and signs that are influenced by multiple contexts. The definition builds on other definitions of communications that have been rephrased and refined over many years. In fact, since the systematic study of communication began in college and universities, a little over 100 years ago, there have been more than 126 published definitions of communications. That's according to Dance and Larson in 1976. In order to get a context for how communication has been conceptualized and studied, let's look at a history on the field. So there are forms of communication. There are exactly 5 forms of communication. Forms of communications varies in terms of participants, channels, use, and context. The 5 main forms of communications, all of which will be explored in much more detail in this report. So, are interpersonal, the interpersonal, or intrapersonal rather in the first one, the interpersonal, the group, the public, and the mass communication. This book is designed to introduce you to all these forms of communications. If you find one of these forms particularly interesting, you may be able to take additional courses that focus specifically on it. You may have been able to devise a course of study around one of these forms as a communication major. In the following, we will discuss the similarities and differences among each form of communication, including its definition, the level of intentionality, the goals, and the context. Let's move on. The first form of communication is the intrapersonal communication. Intrapersonal communication is communication with oneself using internal vocalization or reflective thinking. Like other forms of communication, intrapersonal communication is triggered by some internal or external stimulus. We may, for example, communicate with ourselves about what we want to eat due to the internal stimulus of hunger, or we may react interpersonally to an event we witness. Unlike other forms of communication, intrapersonal communication takes place only inside our heads. The other forms of communication must be perceived by someone else to count as communication. So what is the point of interpersonal communication if no one else even sees it? Interpersonal communication serves several social functions. Internal vocalization or talking to ourselves can help us achieve or maintain social adjustment. That's according to Dance and Larson on 1972. For example, a person may use self-talk to calm himself down in a stressful situation, or a shy person may remind herself to smile during a social event. Intrapersonal communication also helps build and maintain our self-concept. We form an understanding of we are based on how other people communicate with us and how we process that communication intrapersonally. The shy person in the earlier example communicate with us probably internalize shyness as a part of her self-concept because of other people associated her communications behaviors with shyness and may have even labeled her shy before she had a firm grasp on what that meant. Sometimes we interpersonally communicate for the fun of it. I'm sure we have all had experience of laughing aloud because we thought of something funny. We also communicate interpersonally to pass time. I bet there's a lot of interpersonal communication going on in waiting rooms all over the world right now. In both of these cases, interpersonal communication is usually unplanned and doesn't include a clearly defined goal. That's according to Dance and Larson in 1972. We can, however, engage in more intentional or interpersonal communication. In fact, excuse me, deliberate self-reflection can help us become more competent communicators as we become more mindful of our own behaviors. For example, your internal voice may praise or scold you based on through or action. So, based on thought or action, rather. Of the forms of communication, interpersonal communication has received the least amount of formal study. It is rare to find a courses devoted to the topic, and it is generally separated from the remaining four types of communication. The main distinction is that interpersonal communication is not created with the intention that another person will perceive it. In all the other levels, the fact that the communicator anticipates consumptions of other message is very important. So the next form of communication is the interpersonal communication. The first one is intra, and this is the second one, the interpersonal communication. So interpersonal communication is a communication between people who lives mutually influence one another. Interpersonal communication builds, maintains, and ends our relationships, and we spend more time engaged in interpersonal communication than the other forms of communication. Interpersonal communication occurs in various contexts and is addressed in subfields of the study within communication studies, such as intercultural communication, organizational communication, health communication, and computer-mediated communication. After all, interpersonal relationship exists in all those contexts. Interpersonal communication can be planned or unplanned, but since it is interactive, it is usually more structured and influenced by social expectations that intrapersonal communication. Um, Interpersonal communication is also more goal-oriented. than intrapersonal communication and fulfills instrumental and relational needs. In terms of instrumental needs, the goal may be as minor as greeting someone to fulfill a morning ritual or as a major of conveying your desire to be an committed relationship with someone. Interpersonal communication meets relational needs by communicating the uniqueness of specific relationship. Since this form of communications deals so directly with our personal relationships and is the most common for communication. Instances of miscommunication and communication conflict most frequently occur here, and that's according to Dance and Larson in 1972. Couples, bosses, and employees and family members all have to engage the complex interpersonal communication, and it doesn't always go. A competent interpersonal communicator, you need conflict management skills and or others to maintain positive relationships. So the third form of communication is the group communication. So group communication is communication among three or more people interacting to achieve a shared goal. You have likely worked in a groups in high school and college, and if you are likely most students, you didn't enjoy it. Even though it can be frustrating, group work in an academic setting provides useful experience and preparation for group work in professional settings. Organizations have been moving toward more team-based work models, and whether we like it or not, groups are an integral part of our people's lives. Therefore, the study of group communication is valuable in many contexts. Group communication is more intentional and formal than interpersonal communication. Unlike interpersonal relationships, which are voluntary, individuals in a group are often assigned to their position within a group. Additionally, group communication is often task-focused, meaning that members of the group work together for an explicit purpose or goal that affects each person. For example, I may ask a friend to help me move this weekend. Goal-oriented communication at the group level usually focuses on a task assigned to the whole group. For example, a group of people may be tasked to figure out a plan or moving a business from one office to another. You know, from the previous experience working in groups, that having some communication usually leads to more complicated interactions. So some of the challenges of a group communication relate to task-oriented from interpersonal conflict or misunderstandings among each group members. So the fourth one, or the fourth form of communication is the public communication. So public communication is a sender-focused form of communication in which one person is typically responsible for conveying information to an audience. Public speaking is something that many people fear or at least don't enjoy. But just like group communication, public speaking is an important part of our academic, professional, and civic lives. When we compare the interpersonal and group communication, public communication is the most consistently intentional, formal, and goal-oriented form of communication we have discussed so far. So public communication, at least in Western societies, is also more standard-focused than interpersonal or group communication. It is precisely this formality and focus on the sender that makes many new and experienced public speakers anxious at the thought of facing an audience. So, the last form of communication is the mass communication. So, mass communication or public communications become mass communication when it is transmitted to many people through print or electronic media. So print media such as newspapers, the magazines, continue to be an important channel for mass communication. Although They have suffered much in the past decade due in part to the rise of electronic media such as television, websites, blogs, and social media are mass communication channels that you probably engage with regularly. Radio, podcasts, and books are other examples of mass media. The technology required to send mass communication message distinguishes it from the other forms of communication. A certain amount of intentionality goes into transmitting a mass communication message since it is usually requires one or more extra steps to convey the message. This may involve pressing the enter to send a Facebook message or involve an entire crew of camera people, sound engineers, and production assistants to produce a television show. Even though the message must be intentionally transmitted through technology, the intentionality and goals of a person actually creating the message, such as the writer, the television host, or talk show guest, or var greatly. The President's State of the Union addressed the mass communication message that it is very formal, goal-oriented, and intentional, but a president's verbal gaffe during a news interview is not. So, mass communications differ from other forms of communication in terms of the personal connection between participants. Even though creating the illustration of a personal communication or personal connection is often a goal of those who create mass communications messages. The relational aspect of interpersonal and group communication isn't inherent within this form of communication. So unlike interpersonal, the group, and the public communication, there is no immediate verbal and nonverbal feedback loop in mass communication. Of course, you could write a letter to the editor of the newspaper or send an email to a television or radio broadcaster in response to a story, but the immediate feedback available in face-to-face interaction is not present. So, with new media technologies like Twitter, blogs, Facebook, feedback, and becoming more immediate, individuals usually can now tweet directly at, for example, an ad or hashtags to direct feedback to mass communication sources. Many radio and television hosts and news organizations specifically invite feedback from viewers, listeners, via social media, and may even share the feedback on the air. So, the technology to mass produce the distribute communication messages brings with it the power of the voice or a series of voices to reach and affect many people. So this power makes mass communication different from the other levels of communication. While there is a potential for unethical communication at all the other levels, the potential consequences of unethical mass communication are important to consider. So communication scholars who focus on mass communication and media often take a critical approach in order to examine how media shapes our culture and who is included and excluded in various mediated message. So there are key takeaways in this 2.4 or the forms of communication report. So the key takeaways is getting integrated. So communication is a broad field that draws from many academic disciplines. This interdisciplinary perspective provides useful training experience for students that can translate into many career fields. And also, communication is the process. Huh? As what I've said earlier, that communication is the process of generating meaning by sending and receiving symbolic cues that are influenced by multiple contexts. So, uh, in the ancient Greeks, like Aristotle and Plato, started a rich tradition on the study of rhetoric in the Western world. More than 2,000 years ago, communication did not become a distinct field of study with academic departments until the 90s. But it is now a thriving discipline with many subfields of study. So there are five forms of communication. Five forms of communication. The following are intrapersonal, the interpersonal, the group, the public, and the mass communication. So interpersonal communication is communication within oneself and occurs only inside our heads. So on the other hand, the interpersonal communication is a communication between people whose lives mutually influence one another and typically occurs in dyads, which means in pairs. So the third one is the group communication. So group communication occurs when three or more people communicate to achieve a shared goal. The fourth one is the public communication. So what is a public communication? Public communication is standard focus and typically occurs when one person conveys information to an audience. And the last one is the mass communication. So mass communication occurs when messages are sent to a large audiences using print or electronic media, just like Facebook and Twitter. So, my references. You can use this to find or to add the knowledge or widen your knowledge in accordance to my report. So, thank you everyone for listening and good day to all. This is Alexander Kabangbang from Bachelor of Secondary Education, major in Social Studies 4, saying thank you and God bless everyone.
No, pwede na?